culture of people, poetry, prose, theatre, art and cinema. He writes in Malayalam and English, and his articles and interviews have appeared in Indian Literature, Outlook, Friendline, Deccan Herald and so on. His dissertations in Mahashweta Devi's Agni Garbha and K.J. Devi's Maveli Mandam attempted to chart the alternative significations in modern fiction in India. Currently, he studies Dalit poetry in English.
He is a national executive member of All India Forum for Right to Education and part of a teachers organization called Common Teachers Forum. He is two-term elected member of the Delhi University Teachers Association Executive and Academic Council of the University of Delhi. He counts St. Peter's, EMHS, Kottayam, St. College, Trevara, Maharajas College, Ernakulam, Institute of English, University of Kerala and Jawaharlal Nehru University. New Delhi as his alma mater. Welcome, sir.
So, I'll get into the paper straight away. Theorizing the Embodiments, Pandemic Poetry and After. I'll go slow, but we'll try to take a close look at whatever I plan to communicate. Okay. So, one is the notion of embodiment. Why embodiment? When we encountered pandemic, we were all trying to survive pandemic in a certain way that took away all pretensions of ableism from us. We have these ableist perspectives. We have this ableist point of view. What do you mean by that? I would say, oh, I can speak in, I'm a polyglot. I can speak in 5 languages. I would say, no, I can do this, I can do that. Suppose, you accidentally, kind of, you're walking in a crowd and you kind of, stepped on somebody's toes unknowingly. The immediate reaction that you would get is, hey, are you blind? That's a normal reaction, right? But that means we are already in a space where we say that our ability to see is a given. So that is an attempt to look at whatever reached in many ways. Initially, many of these performers were disembodied. You only saw them as a virtual presence. And we live in AI world these days. Of course, AI was prior to pandemic, but AI is much more in the post-pandemic times. And we are not out of pandemic. That is also one contention that I would be developing over the course of the next hour or two. So, what I get to see is that whether it is performance poetry, whether it is, let's say, a theatre performance, screened or streamed online, we all got to a very close encounter with the disembodied selves. We became voices out there in the open. We don't know where it is coming from. And let me tell you, it also, for a change, democratized very inaccessible, elite scholars. We got to, listen to them much more than we got to listen to them earlier. Right? So you would find Spivak, or you would find any like a Western academic now willing to come over to the virtual space and speak to an audience in the third world, right? So, like, in a certain sense, without all those claptraps of the image, you get Zizek, you get whom do you want to listen to? Like, this was done quite successfully in many places. You heard about tales of people completing hundreds of degrees and certificates online. But in the academic world, of course, DU is an elite place. Delhi is an elite place in that sense, very urban space with JNU, DU, IIT Delhi, Jamia, all these places coming together. There is no shortage of academics, critics, and scholars in Delhi visiting. I'm for a self-reflexive moment. I'm a visiting person here. So we are all aware of this politics. of traveling theorists and non-traveling theorists. So the traveling theorists also could not travel during the pandemic time, and they became more a disembodied self for us. Like voice is there. Okay, here comes Zizek with this performance. Here comes like let's say even Johnny Negri. There were Antonio Negri who passed away like 2 days back. Now like there were scholars from all kinds of places being accessible. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, like, one, the notion of ableism that we all carry, which we should critically interrogate to come out of those kind of privileged self-conceptions and privileged understanding of things. Like I was trying to discuss the academic scene in Delhi with my colleagues here. So in Delhi in 2017, we undertook a massive academic revision exercise. And one of the things that we brought in critically and very consciously was disability studies into the academic framework. So that, I think, of course, that project would have reaped better rewards. But now there is another project that is on. That is to fragmentize and to destroy the institutional learning mechanisms with all kinds of reforms. So I'm not sure about the overall benefits of what we have tried to achieve in 2017. But I know that over the long term there will be better prospects for this kind of an approach. So pandemic for me was also and this is prior to pandemic. What we tried to achieve in DU was prior to pandemic, but the pandemic also brought in these kind of close encounters of the other kind. That I am making use of technology in a way that will immediately push the limits of our understanding of embodied selves. Okay. Now, so after this notion of virtuality and disembodiment, then we were fighting back. The whole medical humanities, the whole notion of what is pandemic, how pandemic got weaponized. You should know this. Like December 10th is over. Like human rights is not just a matter of days of occurrence or celebration. But many people were put under all kinds of restrictive laws everywhere in the world under the guise of pandemic regulation. Whether it is, we are all comfortable in recognizing the excesses in, let's say, China. Wuhan mein to, like many things happened in Wuhan. Wuhan, okay, you are the non-Malayali person, no? You are a non-Malayali person, my dear? No. Who's a non-Malayali person here? Like, yeah. So will you be able to follow, little? Because I'm trying to engage with another kind of, okay. So, the point is, China and Wuhan le bhayangara prashna aanu. Avade aalukale mette purathirangan sammachittilla. Ivideyo pathram kotti. No, like here we try to scare, no? Like we are all easily scared. No? So that is the level of discourse that was employed and weaponized in many parts of the world, in almost all parts of the world. So pandemic in that sense brought these kind of aspects to the fore. So we were dealing with these kind of situations, and then the fight back. We tried to fight back. We tried to question the restrictions. We, the scientific community sold many things to us. Most of the initial, like the medical humanities circles will acknowledge that most of the products that promise some kind of solace or some kind of relief at the initial stages were not even really vetted and acknowledged as foolproof mechanisms of viral control. So, but still we went ahead with it, right? So then after that, many of these writings, many of these embodiments came out. One such book is with me. I was going through it. This is something very interesting. I would be reading from other books as well. So this is Singing in the Dark. So a global anthology of poetry. I'm looking at poetry primarily these days because I'm interested in the the whole project of poetry as a site of resistance, and especially in the context of Dalit writing. and I'm looking at Dalit English writing in origin. So like it's not something that has been completely worked out, but very interesting. So this thing came out, like Singing in the Dark, and it's actually like, of course we have Rishi Chawla and of course Sachidanandan as editors. So there is a lot of coverage about how we traversed these days of pandemic restrictions and regulations and whatnot. So that is the moment of takeoff for me to look at how exactly we look at notions of embodiment, notions of disembodiment. Like in a certain sense, like there is a thought police, or there is an attempt to incarcerate thinking that is at display all over the world. So that is a certain kind of disembodiment of our own ability to resist. But at the same time, another acts of wanton aggression and embodiment are happening with many of these people who are put under incarceration and all kinds of restrictive regimes. Whether it is in Iran, whether it is in India, whether it is in other democracies, we have to realize that this is also one way of regulatory control, very similar to the exercise that we witnessed in the name of the pandemic. I want you people to recollect these things while we try to unpack this whole category. Okay. So that's the opening salvo, or whatever you want to call it. So let me get into the paper straight. These are ways of delaying the inevitable. We try to delay the inevitable by like going over the same things again and again. So I start with a quote from Karl Marx, "Old habits die hard." The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism of the weapon. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. Theory also becomes a political force as soon as it has gripped the masses. Theory is capable of gripping the masses as soon as it demonstrates ad hominem, and it demonstrates ad hominem as soon as it becomes radical. So this is Marx's critique of the philosophy of right. A contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. So what is attempted here? So it says that any theorization should reach out to the mass. Now the mass and the multitude, these are two different things. I am not just citing multitude because of Antonio Negri's death, but like there is a difference here. The mass in 19th century Karl Marx is different from the 21st century mob that you get to see in the streets of India. The lynch mob. Like there are theorizations that come very close and would say that anything attempted by a group of people should be considered as mass. But there is a difference, like not just of generations and decades and centuries, but qualitative difference. So Antonio Negri, when he talks about multitude, is actually trying to locate or address these newer meanings of the mass. Okay, so that's my take-off point there. But the point here is that only when what we do in the classroom, if we consider that as theoretical intervention, it will become valid only when it, one, reaches the masses, reaches at a communicative level to the masses. Second, it is radical. If we are only gainsaying what is considered to be the norm, what is the normative? What is the normative? You have first year BA students here? Normative and all, would put them in a spot. NORM, norm, normative. There are ways to do this. Like any term that you are unfamiliar, you can raise your hand and I'll immediately, work it out. Okay. So the normative has to be understood in that sense. So I believe that if we are only mouthing and reiterating the normative, that theorization is not radical. Radical, you can go back to the root, rhizomic, and other kind of things. But at the same time, this is important as a reiteration that what we do in the classrooms are significant. Let us not discount it. Let us not be ivory tower theoreticians and interventionists. Let us understand that when we achieve a level of communication in the classroom, that is a precursor to the possible communication outside the classroom. So that linking up, that ability to link up with people in a radical way is fundamental to my intervention here. And so I try to look at the march of the contemporary from this theoretical perspective. So we have to take note of the march of the contemporary, whatever is happening around us in this way. That is why if you were here, I think I could only see one new entrant here. Like I don't think you were there in the initial introduction. That's not a problem at all. But why I try to say something about understanding our own situatedness as something that is between infinite jest and infinite injustice. ഓർമ്മയുണ്ടത് ഇത് പറയാൻ ശ്രമിച്ചൊരു കാര്യമാണ്. അതായത് അനന്തമായ ഒരു കോമാളിത്തരത്തിലും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അനന്തമായ ഒരു അന്യായത്തിനും ഇടയിലുള്ള ഒരു സംഗതി നമ്മുടെ ചുറ്റുമുള്ള ജീവിതത്തിലുണ്ട്. So something between, and this is not Arundhati Roy's contribution or anything. I can very well lay claim to what I am saying this. This is something that I have worked out. Okay. Now originality alla idinte prashanam. ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞ വേറെ ചില കാര്യങ്ങളിലേക്കാണ്. നമ്മൾ ഇത് കണ്ടിട്ട് what are we doing with all this? What are we doing with all this? And I want to read out something as the second opening remark, if I may say so. So I started with an elaborate introduction, then I looked at something from Marx for a reason, to make this connection between what we do in the classroom and what we should be doing in life. So this is something that I thought I need to read out before I start looking at the books. ഞാൻ എവിടെയുള്ളവരെ നോക്കുന്നില്ല എന്ന് തോന്നണ്ട. ഞാൻ അങ്ങോട്ടേക്കും കൂടിയാണ് പറയുന്നത്. ഫസ്റ്റ് ഇയർ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ആണോ അതോ ഡിഗ്രി സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ആണോ? നിങ്ങൾ MA സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ഉണ്ട് ഇവിടെ? ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ കുഴപ്പമില്ല. അപ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ എവിടെ ഇരുന്നാലും കേട്ടോ. ഡിഗ്രിക്കാർക്കാണ് ഇതൊക്കെ ആണെങ്കിൽ ഈ 3 വർഷം തീർക്കണമെന്നുള്ളൊരു സംശയം കാരണം. ഇതൊന്നും അല്ല കേട്ടോ. നല്ല ടീച്ചേഴ്സ്, ഇതിനേക്കാളൊക്കെ നല്ല ടീച്ചേഴ്സ് നിങ്ങളുടെ അടുത്തുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ ആ 3 വർഷം മര്യാദയ്ക്ക് തീർക്കുക. ഈ ഒരു സാറ് വന്ന കാരണം 3 വർഷം നിർത്തിയിട്ട് പോയെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് പോകരുത് കേട്ടോ. If I must die, if I must die, if I must die, you must live. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. Make that, with a long tail, so that that kite can communicate, okay, and it can bring back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a story. So there is a problem here, what all do we theorize and what all do we make use of? Is it a utilitarian takeoff by a person who is here for a lecture? No, this is more of a lived realization of what is happening in the name of corrective justice in Palestine. So this is by Rafat Al-Ari, a poet who was killed, Al-Areer, Okay, Rafat Alari, If I Must Die. Now, he has been writing poems and he had Gaza firmly in his project. He advocated use of English, very interesting parallels. He said, we all, of course Arabic is fine, but we should be communicating in English for many various reasons. So Gaza Unheard, all these, Gaza Unsilenced. Okay, there are ways in which, he tried to reach out prior to his death last month. Not last month, 8th of December, right? You have to be sure. So, Rafat Alari, when he says that, if I must die, you should tell my story and you should sell my things. Many of us are already into selling their things. Let us understand this. We are caught in this problem, very much in this problem, where we are not even ready to recognize the new norm that we have embraced for ourselves in terms of a critical lack of sensitivity. There is an apathy that we exhibit. We try to equivocate. We try to say that you all follow cricket? Huh? No, cricket is a male game. Huh? Okay. There is this player called Usman Khwaja. Have you heard of him? Usman Khwaja, Australian opener. So he tried to have honest shoes, he wanted to have this thing written. All lives matter. I want you to recollect things. Black lives matter, suna tha? Black lives matter nu kettirunno? Okay. എല്ലാ ജീവിതവും മാറ്റർ ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്നുള്ളൊരു വളരെ ഇക്വോക്കൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെന്റ് നമ്മൾ തയ്യാറാണോ? ചില ജീവിതങ്ങൾ അതിനപ്പുറത്തേക്ക് ബ്ലാക്ക് ലൈഫ്സ് മാറ്ററിന്റെ എൻ്റെ ഒരു കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് അറിയാലോ. അപ്പൊ അങ്ങനത്തെ ഒരു അന്യായത്തിനെതിരെ പ്രതികരിക്കുമ്പോൾ ഈ ഓൾ ലൈഫ്സ് മാറ്റർ എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുന്ന സൂത്രപ്പണികൾ ഒഴിവാക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഈ സുഹൃത്ത് കോടികൾ സമ്പാദിക്കുന്ന അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലക്ഷങ്ങൾ സമ്പാദിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ക്രിക്കറ്റർ, നല്ല പ്ലെയർ, എന്താ പറയുക, ഓഫ് ഏഷ്യൻ ഡിസെന്റ്, into the hyper-nationalist and even racist paradigms of Australian nation state. അദ്ദേഹമാണ് ഈ ഓൾ ലൈഫ്സ് മാറ്റർ എന്നുള്ള എഴുത്ത് ഷൂവിൽ എഴുതി വെക്കാൻ വെച്ചത്. But he was censored. He was not allowed to do that. നമ്മളിവിടെ ഇരുന്ന് ഈ ഓൾ ലൈഫ്സ് മാറ്റർ എന്നൊക്കെ രീതിയിലുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങൾ പോലും പറയാൻ ഇപ്പോൾ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നില്ല എന്നുള്ളൊരു തോന്നലിൽ നിന്നാണ് ഞാൻ ഈ ഒരു പോയിന്റ് പറയാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. അതായത് what we witness in the name of pandemic, we are ready to take a step back and look critically. But what is worse than pandemic is also around us, enveloping us. It has already enveloped us, but we refuse to take note of this. So that is why we need to take note of the march of the contemporary. കാരണം കണ്ടംപററിയെ പറ്റി പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇപ്പൊ നടക്കുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളെ പറ്റി പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഇത് അറിയണം, ഇത് എന്താണ് പറയുന്നത്, ജനറൽ നോളജിന്റെ ഭാഗമാണ്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എന്തെങ്കിലും തരത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു എപ്പിസ്റ്റമിക് സംഗതിയാണെന്നൊരു റെക്കഗ്നീഷൻ ഉണ്ടാവും. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ചരിത്രം പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഇത് ചരിത്രമാണ്, ഇത് കേൾക്കേണ്ട കാര്യമില്ല. ചരിത്രത്തിൽ പല അന്യായങ്ങളും നടന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. റിസർവേഷന്റെ ആവശ്യമില്ലോ, കാരണം അത് ചരിത്രത്തിൽ നടന്ന കാര്യമില്ല. ചരിത്രത്തിൽ നടന്ന അന്യായങ്ങൾക്കെതിരെയുള്ള ഒരു മെഷറാണ് റിസർവേഷൻ. എത്ര കൺവീനിയന്റ് ആയിട്ട് നമ്മൾ ഇവിടെ പറഞ്ഞു പോകുന്നു. കേരളത്തില് ഈ സർക്കാർ അധ്യാപക അപ്പോയിന്റ്മെന്റുകളിൽ തൊട്ട് എല്ലാ അപ്പോയിന്റ്മെന്റുകളിലും ഒരു ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റിംഗ് സാധനം വരുന്നുണ്ട് കേട്ടോ. ആ PWD, അതായത് പേഴ്സൺസ് വിത്ത് ഡിസബിലിറ്റി, ഇതുവരെ റെക്കഗ്നൈസ് ചെയ്യാതെ കള്ളത്തരം കാണിച്ചു നടന്നതിന്റെ ഒരു പുൾ ബാക്ക് ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷണൽ മെക്കാനിസത്തിൽ നിന്ന് വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അതിനെ എല്ലാവരും ഒരുമിച്ച് എതിർക്കുകയാണ്. അതുകൂടി പറഞ്ഞോട്ടെ. കേരളത്തിലെ ഒരുവിധമുള്ള രാഷ്ട്രീയ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി എല്ലാം തന്നെ ഒരുമിച്ച് എതിർത്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. കാരണം 3% പോസ്റ്റ് കണ്ടെത്താൻ പറ്റുന്നില്ല നമുക്ക്, 3 അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 5%. post കണ്ടെത്താൻ പറ്റുന്നില്ല. So there is this situation that where we accept certain things as the norm and we reject certain other things and we refuse to take note of these things. So my attempt here to quote Refat is to bring to your notice the many pandemics that are around us. I can very well say that a certain pandemic of apathy and indifference that has been a mark of our hyper-fragmented lives. ഞാൻ ആദ്യം പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു കാര്യം അതിലേക്കാണ് വരുന്നത്. അതായത് ഒരു മീഡിയ സാച്ചുറേറ്റഡ് സൊസൈറ്റിയിലാണ് നമ്മുടെ അറ്റൻഷൻ സ്പാൻ. നമുക്കറിയാം ക്ലാസ് റൂമിലുള്ള ഒരു ബുദ്ധിമുട്ട്. ഇപ്പം ഞാൻ ടീച്ചർ പേപ്പർ വർക്കിന് പോയോ? ഷിമ മാഡം പോയോ? ഇല്ല, ഒന്നുമില്ലായിട്ടില്ല. ടീച്ചറിൻ്റെ അടുത്ത് ഈ ടോക്കിന്റെ ഡ്യൂറേഷനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് സംസാരിച്ചപ്പോൾ ടീച്ചർ പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്കിങ്ങനെ 3 മണിക്കൂർ കാണിക്കണം. നമ്മൾ 3 മണിക്കൂറൊക്കെ ആളുകളെ പിടിച്ചിരുത്താന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മളിവിടെ എന്ത് കോമാഡിവേഷൻ കിട്ടിയതൊന്നും കാര്യമില്ല. അതിന് വേറെ ചില ആസ്പെക്ട്സ് ഉണ്ട്. നമ്മളെപ്പോഴും സിനിമകൾ കാണുന്ന ഈ സിനിമകൾ സിനിമ കാണുന്നവരല്ലേ എല്ലാവരും? ഒരു സിനിമയുടെ ദൈർഘ്യം എത്ര നേരമായി? 2.5 മണിക്കൂർ. ആര് പറഞ്ഞു അത്? നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നു. ഹിച്ച്കോക്ക് ഒരു കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞു. മനഃപൂർവ്വം നിങ്ങളൊന്ന് ഒരു ചെറിയൊരു ഹിച്ച്കോക്ക് പറഞ്ഞ കാര്യം ചിലർ കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. ഹിച്ച്കോക്ക് പറഞ്ഞത് ഇത്രയേ ഉള്ളൂ: ഒരു സിനിമയുടെ ദൈർഘ്യം ഒരു മനുഷ്യന്റെ ബ്ലാഡറിന്റെ കപ്പാസിറ്റിയോട് അലൈൻഡ് ആയിരിക്കണം എന്നാണ്. 1.5 മണിക്കൂർ എന്നുള്ളതൊക്കെ അതിനുശേഷം വന്ന സാധനമാണ്. അതായത് എത്ര നേരം മൂത്രം ഒഴിക്കാതെ ഹോൾഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും, അതിനനുസരിച്ചിട്ടായിരിക്കണം സിനിമയുടെ ദൈർഘ്യം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ഇതാണ്. പണ്ട് ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കലി ബ്ലാഡർ കപ്പാസിറ്റി റിഡ്യൂസ് ആകുന്നല്ല ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്നത്. What I'm trying to tell you is that these are all controlled by ഇവിടെ 2.5 മണിക്കൂർ എന്ന് പറയുന്നു, 3.5 മണിക്കൂർ എന്ന് പറയുന്നു ചില സിനിമകൾ 24 മണിക്കൂർ. ഡേവിഡ് ഫോസ്റ്റർ വാലൻസിന്റെ ഇൻഫിനിറ്റ് ജസ്റ്റ് അത് ഫിലിമിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവന്നപ്പോൾ അത് 24 മണിക്കൂറിന്റെ എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ് ആയിരുന്നു. 80 മണിക്കൂറിന്റെ സിനിമകൾ അത് വേറൊരു സംഗതി. പക്ഷേ കമേഴ്ഷ്യൽ ആയിട്ട് ഇവിടെ വയബിൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ളത് ഇപ്പോ മലയാളം അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഒരു ഇതിൽ 2-2.5 മണിക്കൂർ. യു ആർ റൈറ്റ്, അബ്സല്യൂട്ട്ലി റൈറ്റ്. പക്ഷെ നമുക്ക് അതിനിടയിൽ ഒരു ഇന്റർവെൽ ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ ഹിച്ച്കോക്ക് പറഞ്ഞത് മോറൽലെസ് കറക്റ്റ് ആണ്. അത് മറ്റേ യൂറോപ്യൻ ഏഷ്യൻ വേരിയേഷൻസും ഇല്ലെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. കോവിഡിന് ഒത്തിരി വേരിയൻസ് ഉണ്ട്, പക്ഷേ ഈ ഒരു കാര്യത്തിന് വലിയ വേരിയേഷൻസ് ഉണ്ടെന്ന് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നില്ല. നിങ്ങൾ ബോളിവുഡ് സ്റ്റാൻഡേർഡ്സ് നോക്കുക, സ്റ്റുഡിയോ സിനിമ, unless it is a box of that kind of mega production, it's 90 minutes, and it has been standardized over the let's say half a century or so. അപ്പൊ ആ ഒരു തരത്തില് നമ്മൾ ഈ പറയുന്ന പല കാര്യങ്ങളെയും നോക്കിക്കാണാൻ ബാധ്യസ്ഥരാവുകയാണ്. So my attempt here is to move on to some other readings of the pandemic embodiments. നമ്മൾ ഈ പാൻഡമിക്കിന് ശേഷം എന്തൊക്കെ കാര്യങ്ങൾ തിരിച്ചറിയാൻ തുടങ്ങി എന്നുള്ള ഒരു കാര്യം. സോ ജസ്റ്റ് റീഡിങ് ഫ്രം റൈറ്റിംഗ് ഫ്രം മൈ നെയ്ബർഹുഡ്. ഇവിടെ ഭവിത വന്നിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. അപ്പോൾ ഐ തോട്ട് ഐ മേക്ക് സം ക്രോസ് റെഫറൻസസ് ആസ് വെൽ. സോ ദിസ് ഇസ് ഫ്രം സിംഗിങ് ഇൻ ദ ഡാർക്ക്. സോ ഇത് പാൻഡമിക്കിൽ നമ്മൾ എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് എൻകൗണ്ടർ ചെയ്തതെന്നുള്ള ഒരു സാധനമാണ്. ലൈക്ക് വാട്ട് ഓൾ വി എൻകൗണ്ടേർഡ് ഡ്യൂറിങ് ദ പാൻഡമിക്. So writing from my neighborhood. Homes are silent, children no longer play in the bylanes, picking up flying frisbees, burying butterflies. I can smell chickpeas sorted in garam masala from my neighbor's kitchen. Our quiet daughters have become quieter. My mongrel is the one who has no panic button on. He sleeps dreaming of his bitch. She hovers around my house, sniffing every corner where he had pissed, and whining in love, he darts to the gate. They kiss each other like refugees from 2 warring countries, home and street. When once my mother was returning home, the bitch hid her tail between her legs, slunk in the street corner with a whine like the docile daughter-in-law in the sitcoms that everybody watches sitting at home during Corona times. My father at 75 sits in a corner watching sports highlights, reading the news on TV, throughout the tone-deaf day. At times he takes a glimpse at YouTube videos of sniff-kissing love in the quiet time of quarantine. My boys make hay out of this quarantine. They mouth it like a lollipop. They are socially distant, preferring online games to playgrounds, malls to seashores. They build tents out of their own bubbles. I have to go out and smell the sea and feel its filthy, frothy gums sucking on my toes. I want to break the roof, let lovelorn leaves fall on my bed. I want to stretch on the ground, branching out my tendrils with the roots. I have traveled a long way from my neighborhood. So this, just to tell you, this was our neighborhood, right? Of restrictions, of a certain way of living life in terms of what we have not visualized earlier. So what we witnessed during the pandemic kind of pushed us to figure out maybe our own repressed aspects. In certain ways it was restricted, but in certain ways it was introspective. I think that happened. But what is the problem with the march of the contemporary? That is one term that I am using constantly for a reason. Because the march of the contemporary is about pushing you into the norm. You're all in a hurry. You have to finish this. You have to move on to the next one. You have to finish this topic. Give the summary to the students, make them write the assignment, and then move on to the next one. So that march of the contemporary was halted when we attempted to traverse the pandemic space. So that is what I thought, the poet is trying to look at in a reflective way. So this we encountered. So that is one thing. Then I thought, of course, when I gave the title to Dr. Shima, I was looking at that after in a different way because Vivek Narayan's after has come out. We had a professor in JNU, I'm not dropping names, but he used to come to the class with maps of Africa and then also books and say that, okay, this is the book. So this is Vivek Narayan's after taking on the Ramayana one, very contextual. Reworking of the Ramayana one. Very interesting. And I thought, that pandemic poetry and after would invite some kind of, then I realized, this is not a, peer, seminar where there would be this kind of, backtracking. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, pandemic poetry has come out in concrete ways of embodiment that you need to take a look at. So Brecht's motto, it goes, in the dark times will there be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. So a lot of songs about the pandemic times. അതാണ് പറഞ്ഞു വന്നത്. അതായത് അത് എന്തൊക്കെ തരത്തിലുള്ള ആർട്ടിക്കുലേഷൻ ആണ് എന്നാണ് നോക്കുന്നത്. Yes, of course, lot of self-reflexive, not self-reflexive, self-gratifying things were also there. So, Louise Gluck, G-L-U-C-K, with umlauts, so it's Glick. She wrote, the night isn't dark, the world is dark. Okay, so we talk about the night being the dark space. But ഈ സീൻ ഡാർക്ക് ആണെന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞ് നമുക്കത് പതുക്കെ കഴിച്ചിലാക്കാം. അപ്പം റെഡി ആയില്ലേ? ഈ സീന് ഈ ലോകമാണ് ഡാർക്ക്. Okay, so it's not just a kind of attempt to make them mundane, look different or anything, but the world is dark. How much do we recognize that? people are not dumb. I'm not saying that, the embodiments, it can be, not so good poem, a not so good poem and a very good poem. We can be, a not so good person and a good person, but we are not bad persons. Okay? I'm not talking about anyone being dark or anything, but when Glick is saying about the world being dark, he's talking about the world being toxic. Pandemic got the matter of toxicity up close and troubling. We all heard about people rushing to online consultations with psychiatrists and psychologists, getting worried about isolation, getting worried about the larger existential questions. Maybe the whole notion of our own self-gratifying importance that we give to ourselves, that got shattered. We started worrying about other aspects of collective living. So I think pandemic poetry, the whole, there are many readings that I planned. So let me see. So pandemic poetry, while recognizing the everyday, also talked about like how we dealt with it. Sometimes with sensitivity, sometimes with a certain indifference. But the moment the pandemic is over was announced, or the moment it got normalized that the pandemic is over, the pandemic is not as virulent as it was at an earlier point in time, we all came back to our own, unconcerned selves. So that is why this whole, attempt here to theorize what got us into. I think I made a reference to that also. That has been made by many people. Malayalis showed a sense of purpose and collaboration and coming together when we were stuck in a difficult situation in 2018. That's all humbug. Let me tell you. I wanted to make that point because how we lost it will tell us more about what we really lacked. You can easily theorize and say, oh, we all came together. Now there is a fire alarm here. We will all come together. Try to rush out in a sense of, collective escape. But suppose, there is another kind of alarm. If I say something that polarizes you, you will immediately see cliques forming together, fighting back, or, resisting. All these things will happen. So, what is more important? This is something that I always tell my students. What is there is of course important. Why it is there is of course important. The text is very important. The context is very important. But what about what is missing? So, academics in Delhi University was disturbed and kind of disrupted by two events in 2019 and 20. Okay, academic year. One is that of the pandemic, 20 March onwards. But you also have to realize in February there was rioting there, the Delhi riots. Okay, so that disruption also taught us many things. Okay, so what is, suppose somebody writes and there are these campus novels and campus attempts that have come to the fore, especially after the pandemic. Many are into self-publishing. You're all aware of these things. Even academics are into self-publishing. We all know the bane of API. API teachers, you ask your teachers, I'm not going to waste my time on such things, but the bane of APIs and all have also published, also pushed teachers into self-publishing. And I'll take a digression here. Okay, self-publishing was a very act of resistance at one point in time. And it is a very convenient thing to reiterate where the norm is that of a benevolent capitalism. So, smizda, the Russian term for that, which is self-publishing, was invented as a strategy that many of the writers in the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Russia indulged in to escape the censors. Okay, so Pasternak, the easiest reference that comes to my mind. That's Boris Pasternak's Dr. Shivago. That's a self-published work. Like censored, if you put that out in the public domain, you will be incarcerated. So what you do is like, this is before the photostat revolution. Xerox. Xerox is the company. So like that photostat thing is not there. You have to reproduce it. നമ്മുടെ കയ്യെഴുത്ത് മാസികൾ മറ്റേ പലതരത്തിലുള്ള അണ്ടർഗ്രൗണ്ട് ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ സർക്കുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന പല മാർഗങ്ങളും. അപ്പോൾ അതിലാണ് ഈ സ്മിസ്താത്ത് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു സെൽഫ് പബ്ലിഷിംഗ് സാധനം. പാൻഡമിക് കഴിഞ്ഞപ്പോൾ മറിച്ച് സെൽഫ് പബ്ലിഷിംഗ്. Of course, I welcome that. But sometimes when you read that, you also see how hate has crystallized. How hate has crystallized into what large chunks of text that can be copied and pasted over to your next PhD thesis or paper that you want to bring out. So we have also plumbed such depths. Are we going to realize what we have done? Of course, as a critique of the institutionalized governmentality around us, around me, I can say that there is a certain weaponization of pandemic and regulatory control mechanisms that has swept across the world right from 2020 onwards. Okay, we have witnessed that. But we have also allowed another kind of travesty to take hold. That discerning understanding about things, that something like ambiguity is fine. Like nobody is against ambiguity. Ambiguity, if that is a state of being, it has to be understood as a state of being. But the way in which virulent hate, I mentioned the etymological connection of virus with toxin and poison. So the ways in which virulent hate has also been, put out post-pandemic over your forums, and these are all self-publishing forums in a certain sense. All inversion of Smithdat. Smithdat was an act of resistance. But WhatsApp forward is the act of resistance. When you do a WhatsApp forward, is that an act of resistance? Yeah, contextually it can be. But many a times, മുഴുവൻ വായിക്കാതെ നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു എക്സസൈസ് ഈ ഫോർവേഡ് പരിപാടി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അല്ലേ? I just took off from a particular point because തിരിച്ചു വരാനുള്ള ഒരു ബുദ്ധിമുട്ട് അതിൽ കാണുന്നുണ്ട്. So what I'm trying to say is that Smithdat എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു റാഡിക്കൽ പ്രോസസ്സിനെ വരെ ഇൻവേർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന തരത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു പ്രോസസ്സിലൂടെയാണ് നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ പോയിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്. So in pandemic, in our response to the pandemic situation, many of these writings and many of these articulations, they have come in this fragmented way. So I want to read now from a book that was released in 2023 only. This is The Absent Color by Anil. It was released by Navyana. So 2 poems from Anil's A/NIL. So I don't know whether you have come across Anil PV. He's a colleague of yours in one of the government colleges in Palakkad. So I was simply stunned by, the first thing that got my interest ticking was a reference to Zizek. My engagement with Zizek is very contrapuntal, very angry and sometimes very appreciative, like very natural, normal reaction to somebody like Zizek. But there is a foreword or a appreciation of Anil's collection of poem called The Absent Color, where Zizek endorses his poem. Okay, so a fellow English teacher he was there in Victoria, but now I think he has moved to another college in Palakkad. I'm not sure which college it is. So then I got reading And yeah, it is something that I would immediately recognize as a very significant intervention in terms of making us retrace and rethink some of those easy conclusions that we have come to. It is always very difficult. The point of departure was when I was talking about what is there and what is why it is there, the context and all. The most important thing is also to figure out why something is not there. Why something is not there specifically. So a student of mine in Delhi, she came out with a book about the 2020 campus. There are a lot of what you call self-publishing, I told you, and there is a lot of market for campus novels in English. Okay. We have to understand the political economy of publication. If you write a novel in Malayalam about campus life, I don't think it is going to work anymore. Like we are past that phase. But in English, the language, like Vijaykumar, they have English, but it's aspirational language. English. It is a language of power. Now, Chetan Bhagat എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ഇപ്പോഴും ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ പുസ്തകം വിൽക്കുന്ന എഴുത്തുകാരനാവുന്നത് അന്വേഷിച്ച് കണ്ടെത്തേണ്ട കാര്യമാണ്. അത് അയാളെ തെറിവിളിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് മാത്രം കാര്യമില്ല, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അയാൾ മോശമാണെന്ന് മാത്രം പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് കാര്യമില്ല. എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണെന്ന് അത് മനസ്സിലാക്കും. ഹിസ് റൈറ്റിംഗ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു സെറ്റ് ഓഫ് റൈറ്റേഴ്സ് ഉണ്ട് ഇങ്ങനെ വളരെ ആക്സസിബിൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ കൊടുത്ത് ക്യാമ്പസ് നോവലുകൾ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ റൊമാൻസ് whatever you want. Most of these books are of that self-help type as well. So, I'm going to read 2029, like 18 to 20, 18 to 21, 3 വർഷത്തെ ക്യാമ്പസ് ജീവിതം. അപ്പോൾ എന്താണ് ലൈക്ക് ഒത്തിരി എഴുത്തുകാരുണ്ട് കേട്ടോ. നമ്മൾ വായിക്കുന്നില്ല ചെയ്യുന്നില്ലാന്നോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പബ്ലിഷിംഗ് നടത്തുന്നില്ല എന്നോ ചിന്തിക്കില്ല. ഓക്കെ, ദോസ് കോപ്പീസ് ആർ ബ്രോട്ട് ഔട്ട് ഇൻ 10,000. ഇംഗ്ലീഷിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ച് അത് ഭയങ്കര വലിയ നമ്പറാണ്. 10,000 ബുക്ക് പോവാന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ വലിയ കാര്യമാണ്. അത് ഓൾ പണ്ടത്തെ MNB പോലെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വിൽസൺ ബോൺ ആ ഒരു അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മറ്റേ ജെയിംസ് ആഡ്ലി ചേസ് ലൈക്ക് ചീപ്പ് ടിക്കറ്റ് ആ ഒരു സാധനം. അപ്പൊ അതൊക്കെ ഇപ്പൊ വലിയ ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയാണ്. ഞാൻ വാട്ട് ഐ എം ട്രൈങ് ടു ടെൽ യു ഇസ് ദാറ്റ് അപ്പൊ ആ കുട്ടി പുസ്തകം എഴുതി നമ്മുടെ അടുത്ത് കൊണ്ടുവന്നു. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ വായിച്ചു കുറെ എല്ലാം ഉണ്ട്. ക്യാമ്പസിലുള്ള ഓൾമോസ്റ്റ് എല്ലാ പ്രൊട്ടസ്റ്റുകളും ഉണ്ട്. And as a kind of assemblage, എല്ലാം ഒരു പുസ്തകത്തിനുള്ളിൽ ഉൾക്കൊള്ളിക്കാനുള്ളൊരു ശ്രമമുണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ ആ കുട്ടി ഞാനത് നോക്കിയപ്പോൾ ഇൻഫാക്ട് ആ പുസ്തകത്തിന്റെ മെറിറ്റ് അറിയാനില്ല, എങ്ങനെയുണ്ടെന്ന് അറിയാനായിട്ടാണ് ജനുവൻലി തുടങ്ങിയത്. പക്ഷെ അതൊരു കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് കോമ്പൻഡിയമായി എന്തൊക്കെ നടക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതിന്റെ ഒരു ലിസ്റ്റിംഗ് ഔട്ട് പോലെ. ഞാനപ്പോൾ ഓക്കെ, ഐ വാസ് ഇൻട്രീഗ്ഡ്. Then I went through it, and when I completed it, I realized there are 2 things that are missing. One is the Shaheen Bagh protest. Shaheen Bagh CAA ക്കെതിരെ ഉള്ള പ്രൊട്ടസ്റ്റ് ഡൽഹിയിലെ ക്യാമ്പസുകളെ എല്ലാം like the Shaheen Bagh protest against CAA was something that the campus got involved. Okay, the Delhi campus has changed after 2016. The JNU Kanaya speechന് ശേഷം അത് ഇന്ത്യയിലെ എല്ലാ ക്യാമ്പസുകളിലും ആ ഓൺ സ്ലോട്ട് നടക്കുന്നു എന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്ന ഒരാളാണ് ഞാൻ. പക്ഷേ ഈ കുട്ടിയുടെ നോവലിൽ the 2 things that I found missing were one, the Shaheen Bagh thing, and the second, the February riot. പല കുട്ടികളും ഡൽഹിയിലെ പല കുട്ടികളും ക്ലാസ്സുകളിൽ വരുന്നത് മാർച്ചിന് മുന്നേ നിർത്തിയത്. കാരണം അവരുടെ എവറിഡേ ലൈഫാണ് ഡിസ്ട്രപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ ആ ഒരു പ്രശ്നം വന്ന് ഇവിടെ ആരും അത് വലിയ റൈറ്റ് ആയിട്ടൊന്നും കണ്ടിട്ടില്ല. പക്ഷെ മൈക്രോ വയലൻസ് നടന്ന അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അത് അനുഭവിച്ചവര് പലരും ക്ലാസ്സുകളിൽ നിന്നൊക്കെ വിത്ഡ്രോ ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു അവസ്ഥ ഞങ്ങൾ ഫേസ് ചെയ്തു. അപ്പൊ ആ കുട്ടിയുടെ ക്ലാസ്സിൽ ഇത് വളരെ പ്രകടവുമാണ്. ഷീ ആക്ച്വലി മിസ്റ്റർ ഫ്രണ്ട്സ്. പക്ഷേ ഈ കുട്ടി ഇത് എഴുതിയില്ല. അപ്പൊ അതിന് ഈസി ആയിട്ടുള്ള സമ്മേഷൻ, there are no easy summations. Maybe somebody would say that her UP Brahmin identity helped her to miss the Muslim question. But she was very much aware of the Rohit Vemula thing. Okay, so the Dalit question, after so many years, the lingering presence of Rohit Vemula was mentioned in the book. and the activisms around that. But after this, the pandemic situation, these things are missing. So what I'm trying to tell you is that what is there, why is it there? With all those questions, you should also recognize what exactly is not there and why it is not there. Maybe we won't be able to find the real reasons and the correct, we may not be able to make the correct inferences. But the attempt is important to figure out why something is not there. Okay. Ableism പറഞ്ഞു തുടങ്ങിയപ്പോഴും ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നു നമ്മുടെ ഉള്ളിലുള്ളത് ഒരു ableist normativity ആണ്. അപ്പൊ അതെന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ആ ഒരു അക്കോമഡേറ്റീവ് അല്ലാത്തത് എന്നുള്ളത് നമ്മൾ ചിന്തിക്കേണ്ട ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്. So that is an attempt that I have tried to make here. So അനിലിന്റെ രണ്ട് പോയിന്റ് വലുതല്ല. One is called no demarcation. That's the smaller one. But the first one is called preface. Preface. In that poetics of ഇതിൽ കുറച്ച് എനിക്ക് ആവശ്യമുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളുണ്ട്. നമ്മളിപ്പോ ഒരു പോം ഇവിടെ വായിക്കുന്നതിന് എന്താണ് റീസൺ? നിങ്ങൾക്കത് തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും ചോദിക്കാവുന്ന കാര്യമാണ്. ഞാൻ വർക്ക്ഔട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ആർട്ടിക്കുലേഷന് ഇത് എത്രമാത്രം ഹെൽപ്പ് ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്നുള്ള ഒരു ക്രൈറ്റീരിയ വെച്ചിട്ട് തന്നെയാണ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ലാർജർ ക്രൈറ്റീരിയ വെച്ചുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാനിത് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. So you can very well figure out what I'm trying to bring in here. In that poetics of decolonization, violence is de-violenced as a psychoanalysis of the subjugated. ഇത്രയും ഹെവി ആയിട്ട് തോന്നും ആണ്, കുഴപ്പമില്ല, നമ്മൾ എപ്പോഴും ലൈറ്റ് ആയിട്ട് മാത്രം എടുത്തിട്ട് കാര്യമില്ല. It was in that poetics of decolonization, violence is de-violenced as a psychoanalysis of the subjugated. It was he who first recognized the cryptic rhetoric of the French non-political thinker. It is the flayed body. Violence has two dimensions. One silences by chopping of the head, while the body remains in its illusory appearance as skin. The other gives you tongues where the body uses the skin. So the other gives you tongues where the body uses the skin. അതായത് നമ്മുടെ ഈ disembodied self-നെ ഞാൻ read ചെയ്യണമല്ല. Maybe it's a forced reading, but what I'm trying to tell you is that the speaking self, the viral, the virtual, viral തമ്മിലുള്ള ഒരു ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റിംഗ് ഇതുണ്ടായിരുന്നു പാൻഡമിക് ടൈമിൽ. ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ വളരെ പെട്ടെന്ന് പോപ്പുലർ ആവുന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പക്ഷെ അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ നമ്മൾ പലപ്പോഴും ആളുകള് ഈ ഡീപ് ഫേക്സിന്റെ കാലമാണല്ലോ ഇപ്പം. അപ്പൊ പലതും മാനിപ്പുലേറ്റഡ് വീഡിയോസ് ആയി. ആ ഒരു സമയത്ത് അതിന്റെ കറൻസി, അതിന്റെ സർക്കുലേഷൻ അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ തന്നെ പോയിട്ടുണ്ട്. സോ അപ്പൊ the other gives you tongues which where the body uses the skin. ബോഡിയുടെ ഒരു സ്കാഫോൾഡിങ്, ആ ഒരു കവറിങ് ഇല്ലാണ്ട് only tongues എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അത് ലിറ്ററൽ ടങ്സ് അല്ല, പക്ഷെ the words and the voice. Let me be personal. I've been partially blind from childhood, myopic. I'm partially insighted. I see through lenses which color the world and lead with their color. To live outside the law, you must be honest. I am not a potentiality for something. I am fully that which I am. Even with my partial blindness, even with my colored lenses, I am fully what? That which I am. A lagoon escapes. There is only desolation around me. I cry the evening. It takes the color of my inverted memories. So the accent color is the title of the book. So it's a play on that. It takes the color of my inverted memories. The point of no return is not a suitable place. Where suicide is a gesture, death is the game. I imagine what is left unimagined by all the creators. I imagine the unimaginable, which as it happens is unmanageable. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. This is what we have been constantly trying to do. We say that we want to relegate history as a footnote. David Foster Wallace in his Infinite Jest, literature teachers are more familiar with Ulysses, James Joyce. it's Joycean in terms of footnotes with endnotes. It's that level of self-reflexive, self-conscious taking. It's not just postmodernism. It's I think he moves into something that others have called meta-modernity. David Foster Wallace. But history relegate ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ശ്രമങ്ങൾ. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് മാർക്സിന്റെ ഒരു കോട്ട് നമ്മൾ എന്താ ചെയ്യുന്നതിനെ പറ്റി എന്നുള്ളതിന് ഒരു ക്ലിയർ പിക്ചർ തരുന്ന എനിക്ക് തോന്നി. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ അത് കൊടുത്തത്. First story. So I imagine the unimaginable, which as it happens is unmanageable. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. That is within quotes. That's the normal response. Now I'm trying to awaken from history. I don't want to be trapped in history. That is our response normally. Her story, the collecting fluid, the white solution against the nightmarish, the lagoon flows. There is a cry far from the scream. The scream is, of course, Edward Munch's scream, the famous painting. That painting in a significance in there. ഞാൻ പറയുന്നതിന് ചില കണക്ഷൻസ് ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ട്. എല്ലാത്തിനും കണക്ഷൻ ഒന്നും ഉണ്ടാവില്ല. അതോർത്ത് പേടിക്കണ്ട. ഈ ആദ്യം തൊട്ട് അവസാനം വരെയുള്ള കണക്ഷൻ പിടിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് ഇരിക്കരുത്. ഓക്കെ. ഈ ഒരു നോവലിസ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ പേര് E.M. ഫോസ്റ്റർ. E.M. ഫോസ്റ്റർ ഒരു ആപ്തവാക്യം പറഞ്ഞു. എന്തായിരുന്നു എന്നറിയാം? only connect എന്ന്. ആ കണക്ഷൻ അങ്ങ് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയാൽ മതി എന്നാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. So I take down these, I try to, I'm not like, there are people who would immediately say, oh right, this is, നമ്മൾ അലമ്പെന്ന് പറയില്ലേ, കുറച്ച് അലമ്പൊക്കെ ചെയ്യണം. ഈ only connect എന്നുള്ള ഒരു പരിപാടി വെച്ചിട്ട് ഈ പരിപാടി നോക്കരുത്. അത് ചാർജർ കണക്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന കാര്യമല്ല പറയണത്. മനസ്സിലായോ? I'm not trying to tell you about, get the charger and get my phone connected. Talking about these kind of possible reach outs. About ഞാൻ എഡ്വേർഡ് മഞ്ചിനെ പറ്റിയാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. ഫോണിൽ അവിടെ ബാക്ക് ബെഞ്ചിൽ ഇരുന്ന് നോക്കുന്നവർക്ക് വേണമെങ്കിൽ എഡ്വേർഡ് മഞ്ചിന്റെ ദ സ്ക്രീം ഒന്ന് ഗൂഗിൾ ചെയ്ത് നോക്കാം. അപ്പൊ ഈ ഡാർക്ക് ലൈഫ്സിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് സംസാരിക്കാൻ, ബ്ലാക്ക് ലൈഫ്സ് അല്ല, കോൺഷ്യസ് ആയിട്ട് തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞു, നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാം ഡാർക്ക് ലൈഫ്സ് ആണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് എനിക്കുണ്ടായിരുന്നല്ലോ സുഹൃത്ത്. അപ്പൊ ഈ മഞ്ചിന്റെ സ്ക്രീം ഒന്ന് കാണുക. അത് പാൻഡമിക് സമയത്ത് ഭയങ്കരമായിട്ട് വൈറലായ ഒരു സംഗതിയാണ്. എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ്? ബേസിക്കലി പാരോക്സിസം, ലൈക്ക് ശ്വാസം കിട്ടാതിരിക്കുന്നത്. ബ്ലാക്ക് ലൈഫ്സ് മാറ്ററിൽ ഐ കാൺ ബ്രീത്ത് എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അത് ലൈക്ക് ശ്വാസവായു പൊല്യൂട്ടഡ് ആവുന്ന, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അത് ശ്വസിക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത ഒരു സ്ഥിതിയെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് കൂടിയാണ് നമ്മൾ സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോ മഞ്ചിന്റെ സ്ക്രീൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് ഓൾമോസ്റ്റ് എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് എലോങ്ങേറ്റഡ് ഫേസ്. ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു കൂടിയ ഒരു മുഖമുള്ള ഒരാളുടെ കരച്ചിലാണ്, ഒരു കരച്ചിലാണ്. ആ പെയിന്റിംഗ് ഒന്ന് നോക്കിയാൽ ഞാൻ ഈ പറയുന്ന സാധനം നിങ്ങൾക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും. എന്നെക്കൊണ്ട് ഇതിനപ്പുറത്തേക്ക് കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള കഴിവൊന്നുമില്ല. അത് ഈ ടീച്ചേഴ്സ് ഇതിനെ അറിയാത്തതുകൊണ്ടാണ് എന്നെ ഇവിടെ വിളിച്ചത്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോ I'm trying to communicate. It's not a good thing. So, Anil is referencing the screen for a reason. Okay. There is a cry far from the screen. Infantile cry, a beauty, the cry for a space, with fisted arms for politics. But where is the cry that cries the death of space? My mother's womb smelled the flowers of earth. They put the flowers, sprang from my mother's womb, the wounded womb, on the grave of earth. And hopes and fists and cries are the remains. I cry like my earth, the reign of my mother. Darkling hopes everywhere, fists in chains, and my violence and my apologies. So this apology is for all of us who are not able to voice enough in support of or in resistance against those kind of crimes that kick out life. And then we try to equivocate all lives matter. No, Palestinian lives matter. Don't be a prisoner of history to say that there was no Holocaust. There was a Holocaust. We are not anti-Semitic or we are not anti-Jewish. But right now, in the scheme of things, you have to say Palestinian lives matter. And then only you can come to other kind of articulations. So, pandemic is not an umbrage or not a cover where we talk about all these kind of situations and then say, okay, but we are here to support all lives matter. We are here, like nobody is asking for death to the Jewish children. Okay, but it is something else that we need to understand what is at play. How do you understand it? Only by contextualizing your own situatedness with what you understand as epistemic outbreaks. Pandemic was an epistemic outbreak as well. Pandemic was definitely a viral outbreak. Nobody is questioning that. We all have lived those, those times and spaces and lack of, air, oxygen and all that. Ambika Sudan Mahamadinte translate wide where oxygen will be monetized. That's already on there. Delhi air purifiers is a okay. Air purifier is something a machine. But I but here it is not so common, right? I don't think it is common here. But there it is for a reason. Okay. But vantage point to share. Now the other poem that I wanted to read out from Anil, the collection, there's no clear demarcation. It's a short one. That's the promise. Huh? We thus arrive at the no clear demarcation. We thus arrive. This is a reference to Westerbaum's Canto. Okay. So we thus arrive at the fault lines of tremor, step by step. Incremental. This is actually an embrace of the now, the contemporaneity. I'm interested in theorization of the contemporaneity for a precise reason. Because when we look at the past, when we try to look at the past and understand what happened in the history, there are these contesting claims, and we sometimes realize that our field of vision is restricted by a certain disciplinarian limits, certain existential limits and all that. Technology, like printing, books, all are part of technology, they helped. But now, I'm not saying that technology is qualitatively different. What we have as, technology right now is enabling something else as well. Or at least, I'm not saying that technology enables, everything. But earlier we thought technology won't be able to enable us perspective. But you look at how technology has transformed this. In the poem, the poet says that in the earlier world, it was always, if something happened, it happened beyond our field of vision. Okay, but now you have 360-degree cameras. Cricket again another metaphor for certain other kind of thing. IPL I always ask a negative question to make you think. I ask IPL so obviously, IPL 360-degree shots the point is, technology, surveillance technology. I'm not talking about your 360-degree, behind the keeper wala shot. Okay, talking about Pegasus. I'm talking about surveillance technology that will, throw algorithm at you. You have done your Google search. You go to your Facebook, you get ads of a certain kind. Okay. There are many memes and jokes about it. I'm talking talking about meme industry. I am talking about what you get as viral forward. I am talking about how these things condition your perspective. Do you think that no, we are conscious beings, we are not going to be troubled by this kind of incessant, attack, the incessant, what do you call it, supply? Okay, it can come from your family group, it can come from your school group, it can come from anywhere. Instagram, what you see there is tracked back. And you think that Elon Musk is the, prophet of free speech? He sees summations that we normally go for. Very difficult to realize what is at stake. So I hope these two poems help me that there is no clear demarcation. If we think that we are outside the frame, no, we are very much inside the frame. And sometimes we are also perpetrators. The time has come to look at pandemic not in those nostalgic way with a twist. Most of us, this I can more or less infer, at least 70% of us here right now would have had some experience with COVID pandemic. All four in my family got. So I don't know, I'm just postulating maybe 70%, 60%. So I know that, we always talk about pandemic with that understanding also. We had a difficult time. Maybe some of us lost lives, lives of dear ones. Some of us had extreme personal tragedy around that time. So maybe it is triggering and toxic to talk about pandemic. But one way of one way we have adopted, one way of handling this has been extremely troubling, and that is why this take on pandemic poetry and after in this way. I can stop here, I can go on, but I would love to hear from you. This is a paper that I am not going to publish. If I am forced to do that, maybe sometime later I'll definitely take a look at it. I'm not into any predatory publication bracket. So, unless you do that, otherwise it's very difficult to turn it into a paper in 2 weeks' time. But definitely, knowledge making is a very sincere project. Most of you are in the cusp of that, new world. So please go in with a lot of, self-critical understanding about knowledge making, knowledge production. Indulge in what you understand as the right thing, but be ready to question your own positionalities. So the equivocation in terms of all these post-pandemic self-righteousness that we have come across is parodied in the academic circle by calling it intersectional. In this intersectional lives matter intersectional approach academic high theory, but let us try to look at what we have. Post-pandemic poetry experience, please, you are welcome to share the space and time with me right now. I have at least 10 minutes more. അപ്പോൾ ആ 10 മിനിറ്റ് എനിക്ക് ലോൺ തരാൻ പറ്റും. അങ്ങനെ ആരെങ്കിലും ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ചോദ്യങ്ങളാവാം, ഒബ്സർവേഷൻസ് ആവാം, അറിയാവുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയാം. ഓക്കെ, താങ്ക് യു.
She is an erudite scholar who has published extensively in national and international journals and has several chapters in edited volumes to her credit. She is the editor of Dialectic of Trauma, Experience and Language, a collection of critical essays on trauma narratives. Her doctoral thesis was an analysis of the elements of popular culture in science fiction. Her research interests are speculative fiction, science and technology studies and cultural studies. A research guide registered with MG University, she is supervising 6 doctoral research works at present. Currently, she is Associate Professor of English at Government College, Kottayam. On behalf of one and all present here, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Lekshmi R Nair and invite her to deliver her lecture on the topic Virgin Soil and Colonial Enterprise.
Thank you so much. Grateful for the opportunity to be here yet again. This seminar, I understand, seeks to explore the multifarious ways in which the politics of the contagion manifests itself in literary and cultural representations, and I believe that the recent COVID-19 pandemic would figure prominently in the proceedings of this seminar. So I thought I would leave the contemporary discourse aside and go back a few centuries in human history to understand the cultural and political contextualization and positioning of contagion. When I announced the title of my talk to our coordinator, I could virtually hear her thinking, what's this? What has virgin soil and colonial enterprise got to do with contagion? But I believe that ascribing political agency to the virus, it began with European colonization or European colonial expansion. And we could say it all began with the Columbian exchange of 15th century when Christopher Columbus set foot in America in 1492. I won't be placing in context any literary text to enforce my argument. I would rely entirely on historical events and factual data to argue that virgin soil epidemics and colonial expansion are inextricably linked. The spread of contagions in virgin soil and the later civilizing vision of the colonial state, it was a strategic part of the colonial enterprise. I would be focusing mainly on the epidemic outbreaks in the Americas, Australia, and India primarily to argue my point. And I must acknowledge my indebtedness to Amitav Ghosh. In fact, it is his chapter titled Terraforming in his book, The Nutmeg's Curse, that triggered this critical inquiry into the weaponization of disease in virgin soils. Now, diseases have always fascinated our cultural consciousness. Be it an individual malady or a collective affliction, diseases assume a metaphoric significance in popular culture. And with humans traversing the length and breadth of the world, both by land and sea, the chance of communicating disease was always very potent and viable. And thus, diseases, especially contagious ones, travel with humans either as an ardent ally or a bitter foe in their long history of conquest, extermination, and expansion. Europe has a long history of epidemic outbreaks, and Europe's tryst with contagion dates back to the medieval era. Several plague epidemics struck the island country of Malta, beginning with the Black Death of 1347, and it extended up to 1936-37 with a plague outbreak in 36-37, and it claimed almost 20,000 lives in 10 epidemics years. So there is a theory called the miasma theory of disease. In the old world, contagions or epidemics were attributed to miasma. This miasma theory of disease was put forward by Hippocrates in the 4th century BC. And miasma, the word miasma in Greek means pollution. And it also refers to bad air, which was considered very poisonous, noxious, a noxious form of bad air, poisonous bad air, or it was also referred to as night air. And this miasma theory held that contagions were caused by miasma, bad air, that emanated from organic rotten matter. And the theory posited that diseases were the product of environmental factors such as contaminated water, foul air, and unhygienic conditions. So from the 4th century BC to mid-19th century, the world believed that contagions were caused by miasma or foul air. However, this theory was abandoned by the scientific world by mid-19th century when Louis Pasteur proposed the germ theory of disease. And this germ theory was later advanced upon by another scientist called Robert Koch. And these 19th century developments marked a sharp deviation from the very idea of disease. It shifted the causation away from the environment to another agency, the germs. And the germ theory also undermined the earlier relationship between environment and disease that had previously sustained the miasmatic theory of disease. In fact, if you look at ancient Vedic literature, we find references to Sukshma Jivanu. And Rishi Kanva coined the term Krimi to refer to Sukshma Jivanu, microorganisms. And later, Rishi Agastya, he proposed that these Sukshma Jivanus, these Krimis were capable of producing toxins, poisons. Nonetheless, in the 19th century, it was empirically established that not environment but germs caused diseases or contagions. And coming to colonialism, European colonial expansion brought, in fact, it unleashed a tsunami of maladies in the Americas, Australia, and Africa, which led to the extermination of aboriginal population. And Christopher Columbus' voyage to Americas in 1492, it paved the way for the exchange of ideas, food crops, populations, and most importantly, pathogens, disease-causing germs. And this is termed as the Columbian Exchange. And the introduction of new diseases in the New World, by New World, we refer to the Americas, Australia, the newly colonized worlds. And the introduction of new diseases to the colonized world was thus a part of a wider pattern of plant and Crosby argued that the depopulation of the Americas was a result of the contact between disease-experienced Europeans and the virgin populations of the Americas. And as Crosby defined them in 1976, I quote, "Virgin soil epidemics are those in which the populations at risk have had no previous contact with the diseases that strike them and are therefore immunologically almost defenseless." Unquote. And his theory provided a very powerful explanation for the outcomes of the encounter between European colonizers and the indigenous groups, not just in the Americas, but in Africa, Australia as well. And even a cursory survey of literature on encounter and colonization reveals countless claims that American Indians died in large numbers because they did not have immunity to old world pathogens. These native Indians were often referred to as epidemiologically pristine, immunologically naive, and with no immunity, they were biologically defenseless to the old world pathogens. And as a result, they fell easy victim to the largest demographic catastrophe in the history of the world. And many historians also argue that the social chaos of encounter with the foreign culture and the structured violence that it entailed, like poverty, malnutrition, warfare, famine, overwork, and other stressful conditions. It also left the Americans quite vulnerable to strange and new diseases. In this context, it would be interesting to know what the American polymath Jared Diamond, J-A-R-E-D, Diamond, had to say regarding the much emphasized vulnerability of the indigenous people to old world pathogens. In fact, in his 1997 Pulitzer Prize-winning work titled Guns, Germs and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies, Diamond makes a very crucial inquiry. He asks why the Eurasian peoples conquered or displaced Native Americans, Australians and Africans instead of it happening vice versa. And he argues that this outcome was not due to genetic advantages that Eurasian people had over the indigenous people, but to certain key features of the Eurasian continent itself. And Diamond argues that our planet has an east-west orientation as well as a north-south orientation. And the continents that are spread out in the east-west direction, such as Eurasia, Europe and Asia, had a developmental advantage because of the ease with which crops, animals, ideas and technologies of food production could spread between areas of similar latitude. And continents that were spread out in the north-south direction, such as the Americas and the Africa, had an inherent climatic disadvantage. Any crops, animals, ideas and technologies had to travel through dramatically changing climatic conditions, spread over longitudinal gradients. And the east-west orientation of the Eurasian continent also helped in the dissemination of, as I mentioned earlier, crops, animals and technologies. And the whole continent became one giant pool of genetic sharing. And latitudinal gradients and geographical obstacles prevented such exchange in the Americas and Africa. Further, in the Eurasian continent, they had very dense settlements, and there were also domesticated animals of Eurasian agriculture. And this also exposed the Eurasian people to animal microbes and facilitated the emergence of zoonotic epidemic diseases. And the initial cost of these infections notwithstanding, the Eurasian population developed resistance to many of these diseases as they were frequently exposed to these epidemics or contagions. And the Americas, who never became one large genetic pool of microbes, they lacked this immunity. So when the European colonizers came to Americas, the indigenous population, they were quite vulnerable to the old world pathogens. And Diamond argues that the result of European arrival in the Americas was predestined. When the partly immune Europeans came into contact with the indigenous people who had no previous exposure to old world pathogens, epidemics resulted in which up to 95% of the indigenous population were completely decimated. So Diamond argues that all of history, especially colonial history, follows from geography. Time and time again, he emphasizes that the racial superiority or the genetic superiority of the whites, the Europeans, had nothing to do with it. I quote, "History followed different courses for different peoples because of differences among people's environments, not because of biological differences among peoples themselves." Unquote. So Diamond's arguments, it actually debunks the myth of racial superiority of the whites. Now, notwithstanding these arguments, this was the other side of the argument. The Columbian exchange had been a very unequal one, especially for the colonized people as they succumbed in large numbers to diseases. Now, disease, undoubtedly, it played a very pivotal role in the colonial enterprise. It simultaneously removed the threat of indigenous resistance, which later paved the way for the philanthropic civilizing mission of the colonizers. And when you talk of contagions or epidemic, introduced diseases. That is, contagions or epidemics which were purposefully introduced into the new worlds by the European colonizers played a major part in subjugating the indigenous population in these continents. And the catastrophic effect of diseases on indigenous populations prompted scholars like Crosby to argue that old world pathogens were the most potent weapons of colonial invasion and demographic takeover, whether intentional or not. Now this naturally brings to mind another question. Were the natives of these continents before the arrival of the Europeans, were they free of diseases? And well, the aboriginal people had their own share of contagious diseases. They were certainly not a disease-free race. In fact, one particular disease called trachoma It was an infectious disease that caused infectious blindness and visual disability. And it was very common in rural and remote parts of Asia, America, Australia and Africa, even before colonization. But colonization, as I mentioned earlier, unleashed a tsunami of new maladies like smallpox, malaria, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, then tuberculosis, yellow fever, etc., to which the indigenous population had no resistance. They had not encountered these diseases earlier. Now, in the context of colonial expansion, there lies a very fundamental difference between the type of warfare Europeans practiced in these indigenous lands. One was the typical Eurasian warfare, and the other was the settler-colonial conflicts. The wars waged by the British, the Dutch and the Portuguese in India, for example, it conforms to the normal mode of Eurasian warfare. Armies, soldiers fighting each other with man-made weapons, and the duration was comparatively lesser. But when it came to settler-colonial conflicts, it was of a completely different order of warfare. And Amita Ghosh, in Macnagh's Curse, he observes that indigenous population faced a state of permanent, perpetual warfare, which involved many kinds of other than human beings and entities. And I quote, pathogens, rivers, forests, plants and animals all played a part in the struggle. They were all part of the colonial enterprise. Now, in the colonization of the Americas, instead of using military violence like the Spanish, the British used material forces and natural processes to very systematically displace and decimate the indigenous population. Non-human forces were used as weapons against the indigenous people. This was done purposefully because the settlers bear no blame for the impacts that unfolded purely in the realm of nature, independent of human agency and intention. All the blame was laid on the microbes. And this framing distinguishes biological warfare from all other types of human conflicts. And the wars of extermination of indigenous communities were largely biopolitical wars, in which the weaponization of the environment was a critical element. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Columbian exchange, it was asymmetrical in every way, but most unequal in the exchange of pathogens. And this imbalance worked heavily in favor of the invaders or the colonizers. Now, the reason for this is that the tropical diseases, it did not travel well into the cold, cooler, humid conditions of Europe. But the old world pathogens that caused diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, etc. entered the Americas, Africa and Australia with the arrival of the Europeans. And it is believed that over the 100 years after European arrival in the Americas, the indigenous population in America dropped from 600 million to 60 million to only 6 million due to a wave of epidemics, warfare and famine. And this is referred to as the Great Dying, GND capital, as it is popularly referred to by Western scholars. And it was triggered by by the introduction of new diseases in these virgin lands. In an article published in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases, John Marr and John Cathay argue that rodent reservoirs from European ships infected indigenous water resources and contaminated land and fresh water, causing the spread of one zoonotic disease called leptospirosis. And this disease killed 75 to 95% of the indigenous population. Then there is another reference to the Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763-65. This was an armed conflict against the British, and what is special about the Pontiac's Rebellion is that it was a pan-Indian resistance against British interests to impose their will and to abrogate native sovereignty. And in the thick of this rebellion, it was crushed by the British very cleverly. They had to face severe onslaught from the Native Americans. And in the thick of the rebellion, the British realized that pathogens were their most effective allies to defeat, to exterminate the native Indians. And the variola virus that caused smallpox topped the list of potential killers. And one day, two native Indian emissaries came to the British fort at Pitt for a parley, for a discussion to end the conflict. And as parting gifts, 2 blankets and a handkerchief from a smallpox hospital was handed over to these 2 native Indian emissaries. So 2 infected articles were given as parting gifts to these people, and this was signed and issued by the fort's commanding officer. And shortly after, an epidemic broke out in the native Indian community, and there was a downsizing of the population drastically. And infecting the Indians by means of blankets contaminated with the variola served as the most potent strategy to extirpate the natives. In fact, Thomas Macaulay described the smallpox as the most terrible of all the ministers of death. White settlers in America used vials of smallpox and cowpox. Cowpox was also another infectious disease, quite literally as weapons. And these native Americans, they used to attack the settler population. So when under attack, the British settlers would threaten these native Indians with these smallpox vials and all its attendant horrors. And in case of a successful infection or outbreak as part of a war strategy, they had another plan in place for these natives. Either these infected natives would be herded into a camp, and then the death rates would skyrocket. Everybody would become infected and they would die. Or the settler communities would simply withhold treatment, and they would let nature run its course. So this strategy ensured extirpation of the natives not through direct action but through inaction. Interestingly, there is one research funded by the UK Natural Environment Research Council which suggests that this mass extirpation or decimation of indigenous life resulted in the abandonment of enough cleared land, which in turn led to the regrowth of forests and a reduction in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which eventually contributed to Earth's cooling. And this period in Earth's history coincides with what we call the Little Ice Age, and a period between 1300 and 1870 when many parts of the world dipped into cooler temperatures. So the extirpation of Native Americans had this effect on the climatic condition of the planet as well. Now there is another book by Sam White titled A Cold Welcome, where White observes that when faced with similar stressful conditions, white settlers also faced a fate that was similar to that of the Native Americans. That is, they also fell victim to diseases that they had brought with them. And he gives the example of Jamestown incident in 1607. And in 1607, 105 Englishmen set foot in Jamestown, Virginia, to establish a settler colony. But the Jamestown area was quite swampy, the water resources were contaminated, and soon the unhygienic conditions and the contaminated water supply made matters very worse for the settlers or colonists themselves, and they fell victims to several contagious diseases and they died out in large numbers. And by the time the first supply of provisions and more settlers arrived in 1608, only 35 of the initial settler population survived. And the Jamestown dying, as it is popularly termed, it debunks the myth that the Europeans were immune to the old world pathogens. And since the locals lacked these immunities, they fell victim to these old world diseases. And David Jones also echoes White's sentiments. In his article titled Virgin Soils Revisited, Jones writes, I quote, although unprecedented in their widespread severity, virgin soil epidemics may have arisen from nothing more unique than the familiar forces of poverty, malnutrition, environmental stress, dislocation, and social disparity that causes epidemics among all other populations. Unquote. However, there is enough proof to suggest that the decimation of American Indian populations that followed European arrival in the Americas was one of the most shocking demographic catastrophes of the last millennium. And Indian populations declined by as much as 95% in the first century after the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And one particular historian commented that early America was a catastrophe, a horror story, not an epic. And this collapse of the indigenous population and the indigenous culture actually established the foundation for the subsequent social and political developments of American history. Later, in the 1770s, you have again yet another smallpox outbreak that coincides with the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary War of the 1770s. Once again, smallpox erupted repeatedly, and once again, those on the receiving end blamed the British for the outbreak. And allegations of biological warfare rose from Quebec, Boston, Virginia, and
Yorktown, and it is claimed that the British officer stationed at Boston, they had deliberately infected the native Indians with smallpox. And George Washington, in the thick of the Revolutionary War, he wrote from his headquarters at Cambridge, the smallpox rages all over the town. This, I apprehend, is a weapon of defense they are using against us. Again, in 1777, a little book titled Military Collections and Remarks, which was published in British-occupied New York and written by a British officer named Robert Duncan. In this book, he proposes a variety of strategies that the British could potentially use against the Native Americans. Among them was biological warfare, and there was a particular section on bows and arrows, how to use bows and arrows. And in a footnote to a 2-page section, Major Duncan makes the following suggestion. I quote, "Dip arrows in matter of smallpox and twang them at the American rebels in order to inoculate them. This would sooner disband these stubborn, ignorant, enthusiastic savages than any other compulsive measures. Such is their dread and fear of that disorder." Unquote. And this little entry establishes beyond doubt that smallpox was repeatedly used as a bioweapon by the British against the Native Americans. Now coming to Australia, smallpox spread across the Australian continent in 3 separate epidemics, and bringing with it alarming death rates. 1789, 1830 and the 1860s. The first epidemic was reported at Sydney Cove in 1789, and this epidemic broke out just 15 months after the first fleet from Britain arrived to establish a penal colony, a colony of convicts. And according to McKnight, for the Sydney region, this smallpox outbreak was a completely virgin field event without the effect of previous epidemics. Now, it is reported in the accounts of earlier encounters with the aborigines that they had previously enjoyed a very healthy state. Their standards of health were high, and they were reported to be a healthy race. But notwithstanding the variola virus, the smallpox virus, it killed the aborigines in large numbers, catastrophically impacting their ability to resist British colonial expansion. Again, it is reported that in Australia, smallpox wiped out complete language groups. And attempts were also made by the British to eradicate aborigines by distributing infected blankets and poisoned flour. And this intentional infection of the aborigines was more than a remote possibility, because the convicts, whenever these aborigines found these convicts unarmed or were straggling, they used to attack these convicts. So in order, the settlement itself was under threat. So as a part of protecting the settlement, the British used smallpox as a weapon. So instead of resorting to armed conflict, they used bottles of smallpox and cowpox to protect their settlement. Coming to India, India has a very different history of smallpox. When the British arrived here, India was already the largest and most populated part of the world in which smallpox was endemic. The disease was already in India when British came here. And temples all over India dedicated to the goddess of smallpox, Shitala. Shitala means coolness, and the goddess is believed to be an incarnation of Parvati. And temples across India testified to the ravages of this disease for thousands of years past. Earlier in the 19th century, British military surgeon Ronald Martin, to smallpox, one of the side effects of smallpox is blindness. And the British military surgeon Ronald Martin reported that 75% of blindness in India was due to smallpox. And in 1869, when vaccination departments had been recently organized in provinces in India, it was recorded that 95% of the population had smallpox at some point in their lives. Again, in 1909, there was a census, and it recorded a 44% reduction in blindness from 1881 to 1901, the 2 decades after vaccination became compulsory. So this coincides with vaccination for smallpox, reduction in cases of smallpox, reduction in blindness. And this substantial degree of control of smallpox in India was largely achieved due to voluntary vaccination, and it is cited as one of the greatest benefits of British rule in India. In the Indian continent, like in the Americas or Australia, the British did not use smallpox as a bioweapon. But its eradication through vaccination was certainly a part of the colonial enterprise, the colonial strategy to extend the philanthropic civilizing mission of the West to its colonies. But this was also to ensure the health of the British and Allied troops stationed in British India. It was not entirely altruistic, not entirely philanthropic. They had some vested interest in making vaccination compulsory. Then another epidemic that deserves mention is the cholera. In the 19th century, cholera killed swiftly and in large numbers, and it was considered as one of the most dreaded diseases. It was feared worldwide, and individuals and governments were struggling to determine a response to this epidemic outbreak. And the first Indian cholera epidemic of the 19th century has been reported in 1817, and its spread was linked to British military campaigns, but it affected both soldiers and civilians alike. Subsequent outbreaks of cholera in India coincides with the revolt of 1857. And several senior British officers died of the disease in 1857. And the large-scale deaths drew the attention of the colonial state, And they became concerned about the health of British soldiers and officers in India. And they instituted a royal commission to examine the health of army in India. And the findings of this commission suggested that fevers, different kinds of fevers that ravaged the Indian subcontinent and cholera were the leading causes of illness and death in India. Now, by the mid-19th century, we can say cholera became global. It transcended Indian spaces and it emerged into the neighboring countries, to Afghanistan, Russia, Italy, Germany, Scotland, and England. And concerned by this fear of being overcome by cholera, the European nations met to discuss the spread of this dreaded contagion. And subsequently they had the sanitary conference in Paris in 1851. And the European nations accused Britain of being responsible for the origin and spread of cholera. And some prominent members of the British society blamed Indian habits for the outbreak of cholera. They insisted that filth in India brought disease. You have Florence Nightingale. She felt that it was part of the civilizing mission of the British Empire to bring cleanliness into India. Now, in the aftermath of the rebellion of 1857 and against the backdrop of global criticism owing to the increasing incidence of cholera, the British administration in India introduced a series of measures towards reorganizing the sanitary and public health departments in India. A new system was needed to better manage the spread of infectious diseases that threatened the lives of Europeans, that threatened global trade and economy. And from 1851 to 1938, 14 conferences were held to standardize international regulations for the establishment of quarantine and sanitary management of epidemics like plague, cholera, and yellow fever. And these conventions aimed to maximize protection from diseases with minimum effects on trade and travel. I would say that disease control thus evolved as a major mode of colonial power, colonial governance in areas of productivity. And attempts were made to protect the social and political exclusivity of the colonial enclaves. It is in these colonial enclaves that these sanitary measures were first introduced and practiced, where vaccinations were first introduced. So the British colonial government took measures to protect these colonial enclaves that were vital to their economy. And disease and its control were thus linked to colonial mode of functioning in practices of settlement, governance, and in economic productivity. And in 1897, the Epidemic Diseases Act was first enacted to tackle the bubonic plague in Bombay. And the law meant for the containment of epidemics provided special powers to the government to measures for containing these diseases and to prevent its spread. And the Bombay plague provided the officials the perfect opportunity for the production and large-scale experimentation of vaccines in the colonies. And Bombay, with its dense population and confined spaces such as slums, hospitals and jails, became the ideal site for experimenting with the vaccines. And while the colonial government did not introduce any legal protection for those being vaccinated, or even experimentally, it introduced laws for compulsory vaccination. And these colonial measures were part of a trend in the 19th century where governments across the world assumed greater legal powers to conduct large-scale vaccination. And smallpox vaccination was made compulsory in almost all parts of the world. But in 1865, we had an outbreak in Calcutta. In 1876, another smallpox outbreak in Bombay. And in 1884, there was a smallpox epidemic in Madras, 3 presidencies. And this led the provincial government to introduce compulsory vaccinations in all 3 presidencies in India. Now, when we think about framing disease threats, we must recognize that the history of international infectious disease control has largely been shaped by European perspective, prioritizing epidemic threats that arose from colonial sites or now post-colonial sites that threaten to spread disease and affect global trade. The recent pandemic of COVID-19 also underscores the link between epidemic risk, xenophobic responses, and global economy. We know that verbal and physical attacks were aimed at people of Asian descent, and even the description of the disease as the Chinese virus are all connected in this long legacy of associating epidemic disease threat and trade with the movement of Asian peoples. And this outlook also reinforces the idea that the supposedly unhygienic habits and weak bodies of the South continue to pose a threat to the health concerns of the world. Now, going back to our initial thread, the entire narrative about the link between colonialism and disease revolves around the notion of indigenous societies as virgin soils, predisposed to devastation by foreign pathogens. And this conception of the virgin soil as an inherently vulnerable entity underscores the notion of their racial weakness and racial susceptibility as against the racial tolerance and racial superiority of their white colonizers. And I would say that the historical narrative has swung too much in favor of the disease that it undermines the other factors that destabilize the demographic resistance of these indigenous communities. And several scholars and critics believe that much of the culpability of colonization has been shifted over to germs rather than the actions of the invaders. And by giving the germs more agency than they deserve, the actions of the colonizers in purposefully decimating an indigenous culture, a population, has been conveniently forgotten. And David Jones again states that by putting all the blame on the inherent vulnerability of the indigenous people to foreign pathogens, the virgin soil construction justifies colonial conquest and the structured violence that was practiced on these people. Now, the virgin soil hypothesis has been time and again beautifully employed for centuries to describe epidemic outbreaks among previously unexposed populations. The story of this colonial introduction of disease into indigenous populations had far-reaching implications. Disease, especially epidemics and contagions, it became an opportunity for the Europeans to initiate and perpetuate the colonizing or the civilizing mission. Having in the first place introduced these new diseases to these virgin lands, now they embarked on a mission of civilizing the natives as per European standards. And this was done by introducing a series of medical practices and healthcare interventions such as institutionalized treatments, hygiene directives, vaccination, etc. And smallpox, again, the most devastating of the epidemics to ravage through the virgin soils, perfectly served this colonial strategy of the civilizing mission. And Bill Ashcroft, in one of his essays, he observes, disease is a specific consequence that represents the whole impact, the whole spectrum of the colonial impact on indigenous societies. Thus, we can say that smallpox in the virgin soils is metonymic of colonization in its various stages. The weaponization of disease and the subsequent implementation of vaccination as a strategy of disease control were attuned to the greater colonial enterprise of colonizing, controlling, and subjugating the aboriginal population. But this practice of weaponizing disease, it invited widespread condemnation, and it was banned in the Declaration of St. Petersburg in 1868. And in British India, vaccination was introduced at a very critical moment in its history of colonialism. It was an additional mark of the fostering care of the British government in India. This is what Arnold David says in his book, Colonizing the Body, which was published in 1993. Again, the recent COVID-19 pandemic, it also underscores the fact that health is a tool of the empire, just like disease had been a tool of the empire back in the 15th century up to the 19th century. Rich and developed nations, we saw rich and developed nations producing and buying vaccines for their citizens in large numbers, while the poor remain either infected or vulnerable. And this situation led the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, to remark in 2021 that the world is in vaccine apathy. So to conclude, Contagion, as we know, has a very powerful reach. It completely defies every fantasy of control. It ignores borders that define and defend human identity, national boundaries. It is considered as a threat to individual security, national security, and even global security. The very nature of its uncontrollability, the unknowability of the contagion, its surprise occurrence in other bodies, in other spaces, in other places, in other creatures, invites systems of control and knowledge. And this explains the existence of this huge scientific and bureaucratic machine of what we call public health. And smallpox as a contagion raged over the planet for nearly 3,000 years. And it was finally certified eradicated by the World Health Organization in 1980. And it is the only infectious disease to achieve this distinction. And this remains one of the most notable and profound public health success in human history. But like colonialism, smallpox also left a great fissure in the cultural history, in the cultural legacy of the indigenous people, be it in the Americas, Australia, or Africa. And as Ashcroft rightly points out, the course of the smallpox epidemic, its impact on indigenous populations, and its eventual eradication is a metaphor for the course of colonial appropriation. Contagion simultaneously functions as a metaphor for the circulation of social, moral, and political dangers to a population, and also as a visceral, horrible infection. And this capacity of contagion to function both as metaphor and flesh explains its cultural resonance, its cultural relevance in contemporary discourses. So that's it. Thank you.